I just want to start with the basics here now that we have a chance to speak with you. We saw history made today in Miami with the former president of the United States charged with a federal crime. Obviously, this indictment is making an enormous amount of news. There's a very political aspect to this as Republicans and Democrats argue over it. But for someone who held your post in the Pentagon, for instance, do you think the charges are worth making history?
Absolutely. I think it was, well, it's a bad day for Mr. Trump. It was a very good day for the American people in the sense that it was a reaffirmation of the belief that we hold that no person is above the law, including the former president of the United States. I had the privilege of serving some 10 years on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Barry Goldwater, the conscience of the conservatives, asked me to serve on the Intel Committee, and I did so as the vice chairman of that committee for half of that time, and then over at the Pentagon. And I can tell you there is not a day that went by that I didn't hold documents and look at them and understand how much it was costing in terms of Treasury to collect the information, how many people were putting their lives on the line to collect it, how many men and women who were serving on the front lines as far as the military is concerned were in jeopardy if that information were to get into hands that were not supposed to have it. So it's a sacred duty, and that's what makes this such a terrible crime if, in fact, the facts are verified. That you put in danger the security of the American people, knowingly holding on to this information. So it was secret, compartmentalized, namely the very highest of security. So that's what's involved, and that's why the former president, is being held accountable.
Did you ever take any of those documents home?
No, I never did. I would be briefed every morning once I entered the official limousine and driving from my apartment over to the Pentagon. It took about 6 minutes to get there. I was given the President's Daily Brief, PDB. I scanned it quickly, saw what I needed to see, and then if I needed questions, I'd leave the briefing book and have someone bring it up to my office at the Pentagon. But I tried not to hold on to anything for any period of time and always have someone with me to make sure that it was always returned.
Mr. Secretary, some of the markings on these documents showed that they should only be shared with U.S. allies, part of the so-called Five Eyes, this intel community. Right. How concerning is it for U.S. allies that this information that they thought was shared just between them and the United States or them and another partnership could potentially have gotten into the wrong hands?
Well, it calls into question our credibility in terms of protecting the information. It also calls into question their security. To the extent they have gathered information that we don't have and have shared that with us from sources that are confidential to them and secret to them, but they've shared that with us. And now if they fear that we don't have a procedure in place or don't have people and a president in place who will revere those documents and protect them at all costs, then they're unlikely to share them with us in the future. And that's one of the fears that many of the countries that I've spoken with recently, they fear that we would have a return to the White House of the former president, and he would act just as cavalierly and just as recklessly as he did in handling these in the future. So they might be very unwilling to provide information to us that might compromise their own security.
So is there something that allies would want to see in place in case there was a return of the former president to the White House, so they can feel that the information they are providing U.S. institutions stay in the proper hands and is classified and protected in the appropriate manner?
They have to be satisfied that we have people in positions of power and influence who are credible, reliable, honest, and are dedicated to the public interest and the public trust. And we also have to have a process in place. The notion that any president could simply wave his hand or telepathically disclose the information in his hands and thereby jeopardize the lives of people who are depending upon him to keep those secrets, well, that calls into question the viability of the United States as the leader of the free world that has an umbrella to protect our allies as well as the American people. So, yeah, they have a real problem in terms of if we don't have the people that are trustworthy, if we don't have the process that's reliable and protective, then they may not share that with us, and that puts us and them at a very dangerous position.
I want to tap your firsthand experience a bit more here, Mr. Secretary, as we've seen images of some of these documents, for instance, those that were splayed on the floor at Mar-a-Lago. Our viewers have seen the same photographs with documents that are labeled SCI, sensitive compartmented information. We've seen labels like talent keyhole. Can you connect the dots for us on what these types of documents might include? We've heard talk of nuclear plans, about battle plans, for instance, that the former president may have been retaining or even sharing.
Well, obviously the Pentagon is engaged in war planning, or planning for wars that might erupt at any moment. Yeah. They constantly have to go through this process. The notion that that would be shared with the President of the United States is not unusual. He's the Commander-in-Chief. And that
would be labeled SCI.
It would be top secret, yes. And you get into more specifics in terms of analyzing what we know in the way of countries who are producing biological weapons, who are engaged in cyber activities, who are doing profiles on individuals, and what that means for our security. So there are so many different layers and levels, but ultimately the Commander-in-Chief has to be someone who treats these with reverence, to say people's lives are at stake. I am elected to protect and defend the Constitution and the lives of the American people and those of our allies. And when you drop that standard and say, I can do whatever I want to with this, I don't need a process, I can wave my hand, I can declassify it immediately without asking anybody. When you say that to the world, it certainly calls into question why they should share anything with us.
Secretary, when you read the reporting and you read the indictment itself, what do you find the most troubling to national security off of these documents?
What's most troublesome is that the president had them, the former president, that he was notified he shouldn't have them, that he refused to turn them over, and then he played a game of hide and lie. Hide the documents, and then if you'll lie for me, that will be even better. If you'll pull those documents out, that will be even better. Perhaps if we had no documents at all. So very clearly, to me at least, he's engaged in obstructing justice. He's engaged in a conspiracy with his aide to help him hide the information and even encourage one of his lawyers to lie on his behalf. So that's what is so discouraging, that he has no reverence for this information. The day after he fired Jim Comey, he had a meeting in his office in the White House with the foreign minister of Russia's, Lavrov, and the Russian ambassador, Kislyak, rather. And what did he do? He gave some information that actually was classified. He said he declassified it there, but he may have compromised the security of our friends, the Israelis. So that's the kind of recklessness, the impetuosity that he displays day after day. And virtually, think about this, every person who's ever served with him has come away wanting to write a book of how bad it was. I don't recall that happening with any other president in our history. Certainly during my lifetime, I haven't. But there is not a person who has served in the White House who doesn't come out and say, my God, if you could only see what's going on behind these closed doors.